Imagine stumbling across a bone, so enormous, so unnatural, that it seems to belong to a creature the world was never supposed to see. Not a wolf, not an elephant, not even a whale, something older, stranger. Something that looks as if it had crawled out of a nightmare buried beneath the stone. For centuries, that is exactly the kind of terror one mystery fossil inspired in England. It appeared without context, without a complete skeleton, without a living equivalent, and yet it carried the weight of a vanished world. The people who first saw it had no word for what it was. They had no concept of dinosaurs. So what do you call a monster when your civilization doesn't even know monsters like it ever existed? That question haunted scholars long before science was ready to answer it. In the late 1600s, workers digging through the limestone around Stonesfield in Oxfordshire unearthed part of a huge thigh bone. It was thick, dense, and absurdly oversized. To the modern eye, it would already hint at something prehistoric. But to the minds of that era, it was a riddle with impossible answers. Some believed it came from a Roman war elephant. Others insisted it must have belonged to a biblical giant. Both explanations say more about the people than the bone itself. They were trying to force the unknown into the narrow space of what they thought the world allowed. And yet the fossil refused to fit. It was too massive, too ancient, too wrong. That should have been the first warning that the truth was far more extraordinary than anyone imagined. What makes the story even more incredible is that this wasn't just any bone. This fragment would eventually be linked to one of the most important animals in the history of science. Not the biggest predator ever to live, not the most famous, not the deadliest by modern standards, but in many ways, one of the most consequential. Because the animal connected to that bone would become the first dinosaur ever to be validly named. Before Tyrannosaurus, before Triceratops, before the word dinosaur itself even existed. Long before giant reptiles ruled books, museums, and popular imagination, one predator stood alone at the threshold of discovery, waiting for humanity to recognize it. And that predator was Megalosaurus. Even the name has a kind of old power to it. Great lizard. Simple. Bold, almost primitive. It sounds like the sort of title someone would give to a creature only half understood. And that is exactly what happened. When Megalosaurus entered science, it did not arrive as a complete body or a perfect revelation. It arrived in pieces, through doubt, confusion, and a series of interpretations that now seem almost unbelievable. But those mistakes matter, because they reveal just how radical the truth really was. People did not fail to understand Megalosaurus because they were foolish. They failed because the creature belonged to a reality so ancient and so alien that the human mind had to stretch itself to even begin imagining it. By the early 1800s, more fossils had turned up in the same general region. Teeth, a lower jaw, limb bones, fragments that seemed to whisper that the first strange discovery had not been a freak accident. There had been an animal behind all this, a real one. An animal large enough to shake the assumptions of natural history. These remains eventually came under the attention of William Buckland, a brilliant and deeply complex naturalist from Oxford. Buckland was working in an age when the past was still being assembled from scraps. There were no dinosaur textbooks to consult, no family tree of theropods, no museum halls lined with reconstructed skeletons. He was dealing with a puzzle without a picture on the box. And yet, Buckland sensed the scale of what he was seeing. In 1824, he formally described Megalosaurus, giving science its first valid dinosaur genus. That moment was monumental, even if few people fully realized it at the time. But here is where the story becomes almost irresistible. Buckland got the animal both right and wrong in fascinating ways. He correctly recognized it as a gigantic reptilian carnivore, something built for flesh rather than leaves. Its teeth gave that away. They were sharp, curved, and violent in form. But his reconstruction of the full animal still reflected the limits of the era. He imagined something more lizard-like than dinosaurian, heavy, quadrupedal, possibly able to move through land and water. A beast that lived somewhere between a monitor lizard and a crocodile, scaled up to grotesque proportions. It is easy to laugh at that image now. But pause for a moment and consider how terrifying that would have sounded to people hearing about it for the first time. A giant meat-eating reptile from a lost age, powerful enough to tear through living flesh, emerging from the stones of England itself. This was not just a scientific curiosity. It was a direct challenge to how people imagined the deep past. Worse still, the more fossils appeared, the more it became obvious that Megalosaurus was not alone. If one giant predator had walked the Earth, what else had? What other worlds had existed before human memory began? What entire ages had vanished without leaving more than broken bones? Those questions would only deepen as the century continued. At first, the early estimates of Megalosaurus were wildly exaggerated. Some reconstructions pushed its size to absurd extremes, imagining an animal over 12 meters long, even more when artistic fear took over from anatomical caution. The incomplete remains encourage speculation, and speculation loves scale. The less complete the skeleton, the easier it is to make the monster larger. But science, unlike myth, keeps tightening the net. As more fossil material came to light, and as other dinosaurs were described, the image of Megalosaurus slowly changed. It lost its amphibious haze. It stood up. It became bipedal. It became more active, more predatory, more focused. In a sense, Megalosaurus had to wait for the entire field of paleontology to mature before it could become itself. And that transformation raises another mystery. If this animal was so historically important, why does it feel strangely overshadowed today? Why is the first named dinosaur so often left in the shadows, while later giants dominate the spotlight? The answer lies partly in the fossils themselves. Megalosaurus is famous, but frustratingly incomplete. Its legacy is enormous. Its bones, not so much. For an animal that changed science forever, it has left behind a surprisingly patchy record. That gap between fame and evidence has shaped everything that followed. Because the truth is, the deeper paleontologists looked into Megalosaurus, the more complicated it became. For a long time, all sorts of fossils from different places were tossed into the genus. If a large theropod bone looked old and vaguely similar, there was a good chance someone would call it Megalosaurus. The name became a kind of catch-all label for mystery predators. It spread too far, too fast, dragging confusion behind it. Later, scientists would have to strip those mistakes away one by one, asking a painful question. How much of what we thought we knew about Megalosaurus actually belonged to Megalosaurus at all? That is where the story turns from legend into detective work. And once that process began, the animal that emerged was no less impressive. In fact, it may have been even more fascinating. Because hidden beneath centuries of error was a real predator from the Middle Jurassic, one that ruled a very different England, stalked strange prey through lush coastal habitats, and carried in its bones the opening chapter of dinosaur science. But to understand that world, and to see the animal that truly stood at its center, we have to leave behind the Victorian monster and step into a lost landscape 166 million years old, where the real Megalosaurus was only beginning to reveal itself. By the time the mist of early speculation began to clear, one thing had become impossible to ignore. Megalosaurus was not some bloated, swamp-haunting lizard dragging itself through mud. It was something faster, sharper, and far more dangerous. But that realization did not arrive all at once. It came in fragments, just like the animal itself. A jawbone here, a vertebra there, limbs, hips, teeth, partial pieces of a body that refused to show itself completely. And that incompleteness created a tension that still surrounds Megalosaurus today. How do you reconstruct a predator that made history, when the history of its own body is full of blanks? That puzzle became one of paleontology's most enduring challenges. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, more dinosaur discoveries from around the world began to reshape how scientists saw predatory dinosaurs. Suddenly, there were clearer examples of theropods, animals built on two legs, with powerful hind limbs, balancing tails, grasping forelimbs, and skulls designed for attack. With each new find, the old image of Megalosaurus looked less convincing. If its teeth were theropod teeth, if its leg bones matched the proportions of bipedal carnivores, if its pelvis suggested an upright posture, then the old lumbering reptile had to go. In its place rose something much more dramatic. A large Middle Jurassic hunter moving through its world with purpose. Yet even then, Megalosaurus remained frustratingly elusive. It was historically famous, yes, but in practical anatomical terms, other theropods often seemed easier to understand. Later predators are known from better skeletons. Some have near-complete skulls. Others preserve clear limb proportions, vertebral sequences, even skin impressions or feather evidence in related forms. Megalosaurus, by contrast, became a paradox. The first named dinosaur was one of the most scientifically important, yet one of the least straightforward to visualize with confidence. That gap only made the animal more intriguing. The question shifted from, what is this thing? To, how much have we still gotten wrong? By the early 21st century, paleontologists had pulled together as much material as possible to create a more reliable reconstruction. This did not magically solve every uncertainty, but it narrowed the range of fantasy. The modern picture of Megalosaurus is far more disciplined, and somehow that restraint makes it more compelling. It appears to have been a medium to large theropod, roughly 6 to 9 meters in length, with a heavily built frame and an estimated weight of around a ton. Not a giant on the scale of Tyrannosaurus or Spinosaurus, no, but that comparison is misleading. Megalosaurus did not need to be the biggest predator of all time. It only needed to be one of the dominant carnivores of its own age. And in the Middle Jurassic, that was more than enough to make it terrifying. Its body was robust, in a way that suggests strength rather than grace. This was not a lightly built sprinter, shaped for long pursuit across open plains. Megalosaurus seems to have been more heavily muscled, especially through the hips and torso, with a deep chest and a skull proportionally large for its body. That skull is one of the most tantalizing pieces of the mystery, because although complete skull material is rare, the evidence suggests a head built for force. Strong jaws, deep bite, teeth like knives. Not delicate slicing tools, but curved, serrated instruments meant to open flesh and hold struggling prey. Every fragment pushes the same idea. Whatever uncertainty remains about its exact outline, Megalosaurus was no lightweight. It was a serious predator with serious hardware. And then there are the arms, which open another loop in the story. For years, the public imagination trained itself to think of large theropod arms as either absurdly tiny or almost irrelevant, largely because of the shadow cast by Tyrannosaurus. Megalosaurus complicates that expectation. Its forelimbs were relatively short, yes, but not useless. They appear stout, strong, and likely ended in 3 clawed digits. That raises a question paleontologists still debate. What exactly were they doing? Were they gripping prey at close range? Anchoring a victim during a bite? Slashing? Pushing up from rest? The answer is still unsettled, and that uncertainty only sharpens the image. There is something far more unsettling about a predator when you cannot fully account for all its weapons. Its legs add another subtle clue. Compared with some relatives, Megalosaurus may not have had especially long or gracile hind limbs. That suggests it was not built as a pure speed specialist. Instead, it may have relied on power, ambush, and controlled aggression. Picture a predator moving through dense vegetation along muddy coastal ground, perhaps through island habitats and floodplains broken by waterways. In such a world, acceleration, strength, and positioning might matter more than top speed. And if that interpretation is right, then Megalosaurus was not simply running prey down across endless open terrain. It was choosing its moment, closing distance, turning the landscape itself into part of the kill. But what did that landscape actually look like? This is where the story becomes stranger than many people expect. The England Megalosaurus knew did not resemble modern England in any familiar sense. Forget cool fields and gray skies. Travel back 166 million years, and you enter a much warmer, more humid, more fragmented world. The region was lush, subtropical, and shaped by shallow seas, river systems, low-lying islands, and rich vegetation. Ferns spread across the ground. Ginkgo-like trees and conifers rose above them. Water lay close at hand. Sediments from formations like the Tainton limestone hint at a dynamic environment where land and sea interacted constantly. This was not a static backdrop. It was a living maze. That setting changes everything. A predator is only as interesting as the world that made it, and Megalosaurus belonged to a world in transition. The Middle Jurassic is often overshadowed by the later periods that produced icons like Stegosaurus, Allosaurus, and Tyrannosaurus. But that earlier age was a critical evolutionary theater. The great dynasties of dinosaurs were still taking shape. The continents were arranged differently. Ecosystems were assembling in combinations that no longer exist. Megalosaurus stood in the middle of that unfolding drama, not at the end of the dinosaur story, but deep in its rise. And it was not alone. That is another crucial detail. England's Jurassic ecosystem supported other dinosaurs, including large herbivores such as Cetiosaurus and stegosaurs like Lexivosaurus, or related forms, depending on locality and interpretation. Imagine what that means. Somewhere in those fern-heavy habitats, heavy-footed plant eaters were moving in groups or pairs, tearing at vegetation, leaving tracks in wet ground, while one of the era's top carnivores watched from cover. Every herbivore in that environment changed the stakes for Megalosaurus. Big prey means risk. It also means reward. A successful attack could feed a predator for days. A failed one could break bones. And broken bones are part of this story too. Some Megalosaurus remains show injuries, fractures that hint at violence in life. That matters. It tells us this was not some untouchable apex machine gliding through its ecosystem without consequence. Hunting large animals is brutal. Even a successful predator pays a price. One kick, one tail strike, one badly timed lunge, and the hunter becomes the wounded one. Suddenly, the animal stops feeling like a museum abstraction and starts feeling alive. It had to survive pain. It had to recover. It had to keep hunting in a world where one mistake could become fatal. All of this raises an irresistible possibility. If Megalosaurus was already this formidable, if it occupied such a rich ecosystem, and if it stood at the top of one of the earliest well-known Jurassic food webs, then what exactly was sharing that world with it? Because the deeper we look into Middle Jurassic England, the more crowded and competitive the picture becomes. Megalosaurus may have been a top predator, but top predator never means only predator. And once rival hunters enter the frame, the story becomes much more dangerous. The moment other carnivores enter the picture, Megalosaurus stops being just a killer and becomes something even more compelling, a survivor in a competitive world. Apex predators do not simply dominate because they are strong. They dominate because they endure pressure, from prey, from injuries, from rivals, and from an environment that never gives them a day off. In the world of Megalosaurus, every meal had a cost, and every shadow may have hidden another hunter watching the same opportunity. That is where the story begins to tighten. Because for all the attention paid to Megalosaurus as the first named dinosaur, its true life may have been defined less by fame and more by conflict. Middle Jurassic England was not empty territory waiting for one predator to claim it. It was a living arena. Fossils from roughly the same broad span of time suggest the presence of other theropods, some fragmentary and controversial, but enough to hint that Megalosaurus did not hunt in splendid isolation. Names like Streptospondylus, Iliosuchus, and Cruxicaros have floated around discussions of Middle Jurassic carnivores, though not all are as secure or directly comparable as the public retelling often suggests. That uncertainty matters, because it reminds us how fragmentary this entire world remains. But the wider point stands. Megalosaurus existed among other predatory dinosaurs, not outside them. It was part of a carnivore guild. That simple fact opens up a string of questions that refuse to sit quietly. Did these predators compete directly? Did they partition prey by size, habitat, or hunting style? Did one favor coastal flats while another preferred inland woodland? Did Megalosaurus ambush large herbivores while smaller theropods specialized in juveniles, carrion, or quick-moving prey? Paleontology rarely offers clean behavioral scripts, but ecosystems leave clues. When multiple meat-eaters coexist, they usually do so by dividing the living world into different opportunities. And if Megalosaurus was the most common and widespread large theropod in its environment, that suggests it had an edge, something in its build, behavior, or ecological flexibility that allowed it to sit higher in the food web than the others. Its strength may have been exactly that, versatility. Megalosaurus was heavily built, but not so massive that it became locked into one narrow way of life. It was large enough to threaten sizable dinosaurs, and perhaps opportunistic enough to exploit smaller animals when needed. That flexibility could be the hidden key to its success. The Jurassic does not reward specialists when conditions shift. Flooded plains, island environments, seasonal changes in water access, migrations of prey, these can all destabilize a predator's routine. A hunter that can switch tactics survives. A hunter that insists on one perfect strategy may starve. So maybe the true power of Megalosaurus was not raw force alone. Maybe it was adaptability disguised as brute strength. And then there's the prey itself, which may be the most underappreciated part of the entire story. The herbivores of Megalosaurus's world were not passive scenery. Sauropods, even medium-sized ones, were dangerous simply because of scale. A sweeping tail, a stamping foot, the collective alarm of a group, any of these could injure a predator badly. Stegosaurs were even worse in some ways. Their tails were not decorative. Those spikes could turn a reckless attack into a disaster. If Megalosaurus hunted animals like these, it was gambling with every ambush. That changes the emotional tone of the predator immediately. Instead of imagining a cartoon villain mowing through helpless victims, you begin to see a hunter forced into high-risk decisions, reading body language, searching for weakness, waiting for one mistake from the herd. Imagine the scene. Dense green growth, insects screaming in the humid air, water glinting somewhere beyond a tangle of ferns, a group of herbivores moving slowly, their attention scattered. Perhaps a sick individual lags behind. Perhaps a juvenile strays too far from protection. Somewhere nearby, Megalosaurus has already seen the opportunity. Not rushing, not announcing itself, just waiting. That is the thing about predators we often forget. The drama is not only in the attack, it is in the stillness before it. The patience, the calculation, the long silence that suddenly explodes into violence. And in that silence, there is always another question. How often did these hunts fail? Failure may be as important as success in understanding Megalosaurus. The fossil injuries suggest a dangerous life, but they also imply resilience. A predator that heals is a predator that lived long enough to matter. Broken or damaged bones do not just tell stories of pain, they tell stories of survival. Megalosaurus endured trauma and kept going. That endurance is easy to romanticize, but in ecological terms, it is brutally practical. Every day spent recovering is a day spent vulnerable. Wounds attract infection. Reduced mobility means less food. A single bad injury can turn an apex hunter into carrion. So if Megalosaurus repeatedly survived those dangers, then this was not a flimsy animal. It was built to withstand punishment. There is another possibility too, one that adds a darker layer. What if Megalosaurus was not only a hunter of large dinosaurs, but an opportunist, willing to take whatever the environment offered? Smaller reptiles, mammaliaforms, fish near waterways. Pterosaurs scavenged from shorelines, carrion washed into accessible areas. We do not have smoking gun proof for every menu item, but large theropods are rarely picky when opportunity appears. In a habitat threaded with water and crowded with life, opportunism would not be weakness, it would be intelligence. The more options a predator recognizes, the more often it eats. And that may partly explain why Megalosaurus persisted as a successful carnivore in a changing landscape. Yet for all this danger and tension, perhaps the strangest part of the story is how little certainty we still possess about the full animal. Think about that. Megalosaurus helped open the scientific door to Dinosauria, and even now we cannot point to one perfect, unquestioned, complete skeleton and say, there it is, exactly as it lived. The skull remains incomplete, the vertebrae are scarce, some anatomical details remain debated. The public often assumes the first named dinosaur should be among the best known, but Megalosaurus breaks that expectation completely. Its fame was secured by history. Its body still negotiates with mystery. That tension between importance and incompleteness is exactly why Megalosaurus remains so compelling. It is not just a dinosaur. It is a case study in how science grows. At first, people mistake a femur for an elephant or giant. Then they recognize a huge reptile, then a carnivore, then a bipedal theropod, then one species instead of many, then a more refined ecological interpretation. Knowledge does not arrive as a lightning bolt. It arrives as correction after correction, each one cutting away a little more error. Megalosaurus teaches that beautifully and almost cruelly, because it was there at the beginning, forcing science to evolve just to keep up with it. But here is the twist that gives the story another surge of momentum. The animal's scientific importance may have overshadowed its emotional power. People know Megalosaurus as a historical milestone. Fewer stop to imagine what it actually felt like as a living creature in its own time. Its presence, its movement, the pressure of its bite, the way the ground might have changed when it entered a clearing. And once you begin to think about that, another possibility emerges. Perhaps Megalosaurus is not underappreciated because it lacked grandeur. Perhaps it is underappreciated because the full grandeur of its life has been buried under the weight of its legacy. And if that is true, then the next question becomes unavoidable. How did a predator so important, so storied, and so foundational slowly fade behind the giants that came after it? Why did the first named dinosaur become, for so many people, a footnote to its own revolution? The answer lies not just in the fossils, but in the strange way fame works in science, and in how later monsters stole the spotlight from the one that first taught us where to look. There is something almost unfair about Megalosaurus. It opened the door, but others got the applause. Once the age of dinosaur discovery truly accelerated, the world met a parade of increasingly spectacular animals. Long-necked giants, horned tanks, predators with skulls the size of bathtubs. Then came the media age, and with it, the rise of celebrity dinosaurs. Tyrannosaurus became the king. Velociraptor became the cunning killer. Spinosaurus became the bizarre outlier. Even Allosaurus, which lived much later, came to embody the classic Jurassic carnivore in the public imagination. In that avalanche of attention, Megalosaurus drifted into an odd place, revered by historians of paleontology, but strangely absent from mainstream awe. Why? Part of the answer is brutally simple. Better fossils make better icons. Tyrannosaurus has a massive, unmistakable skull. Spinosaurus has a sail that looks almost invented. Velociraptor carries the gift of cinematic identity. Megalosaurus has something less visible, but arguably more profound: historical gravity. That is harder to package. It does not leap off a screen in a single silhouette. It asks for patience, context, imagination. And in a culture that often rewards spectacle over significance, the dinosaur that began everything can end up feeling less vivid than the ones that followed. But that should not fool us. Megalosaurus was not some primitive draft version of better predators to come. It was a fully real, fully dangerous carnivore, shaped by the needs of its own world. Calling it primitive in the evolutionary sense does not make it crude. It simply places it earlier on a branching path. In some ways, that makes it even more fascinating. This animal existed during a time when many theropod lineages were still differentiating, when ecosystems were still assembling the caste that would later dominate the Jurassic and Cretaceous. Megalosaurus was not late to the party. It was there while the rules were still being written. That early position matters enormously. The family Megalosauridae, named after Megalosaurus itself, includes a group of theropods that reveal important patterns in the evolution of large carnivorous dinosaurs. These animals were widespread, and many shared certain skull and skeletal traits that set them apart from later theropod forms. Some had elongated low skulls. Some retained body plans that now look transitional, only because we are viewing them backward through time. But in their own moment, they were not transitional. They were current, successful, functional. The world did not know they would be replaced. Neither did they. Megalosaurus also forces us to confront how incomplete evidence can distort fame. Because the genus became a taxonomic dumping ground for so long, untangling the real animal took decades of scholarly cleanup. Species once assigned to Megalosaurus were scattered across Europe and beyond. But most of those assignments were eventually rejected. Once paleontologists became stricter about anatomy and diagnostic traits, the genus shrank dramatically. Today, only Megalosaurus bucklandii is widely accepted. That narrowing might sound like a demotion, but it is actually a vindication. The real Megalosaurus is not less important because fewer bones belong to it. It is more real because false baggage has been cut away. And what remains is powerful. A predator from Middle Jurassic England, roughly 1 ton, approximately 6 to 9 meters long, strongly built, likely armed with a formidable bite and sturdy forelimbs, resident of a warm, fern-rich landscape shaped by coastlines, islands, and shifting waterways. Possible hunter of sauropods, stegosaurs, and any smaller prey it could seize. Injured in life, healed, and survived. Famous before the concept of dinosaurs existed, yet still not completely known. If that does not sound like the perfect creature for myth, then perhaps the problem is not Megalosaurus. Perhaps the problem is that we have become too used to looking past the first chapter because we already know the ending. And that first chapter is astonishing when you linger on it. Think of the timeline. A bone is found in the 17th century. It is misidentified. Another scholar gives it a bizarre name based on how it looks. More remains appear. In 1824, Buckland names Megalosaurus. In 1842, Richard Owen uses Megalosaurus alongside Iguanodon and Hylaeosaurus to define Dinosauria. In other words, this predator is present at nearly every critical threshold in the birth of dinosaur science. It is there before dinosaurs exist as an idea. It is there when the first dinosaur genus is named. It is there when the category itself is born. How many animals can claim that kind of legacy? And yet, legacy can become a trap. Once an animal is fixed in history as the first named dinosaur, people can stop seeing it as an animal at all. It becomes a factoid, a museum label, a trivia answer. But Megalosaurus was never just a historical footnote embedded in stone. It was a living predator that smelled blood, navigated heat and humidity, tracked prey, suffered injuries, and died in a world with no humans to witness it. The more you return that life to the bones, the more haunting the story becomes. Because this was not just the first named dinosaur. This was a creature that waited more than 160 million years for a species smart enough to recognize what it had found. And even then, recognition came slowly. There is a strange melancholy in that. Megalosaurus changed how we understand life on Earth, but it never got the full clarity later dinosaurs received. Its skeleton remains incomplete. Its exact appearance is still partly inferred. It gave us the beginning, then slipped back behind the curtain, while louder names took center stage. But maybe that is exactly why it matters so much. It reminds us that discovery is not always clean, and importance is not always flashy. Sometimes the most revolutionary creature is the one that first whispers, not the one that later shouts. And there is still one more reason Megalosaurus deserves attention. It sits at the intersection of mystery and certainty in a way few dinosaurs do. We know what it means historically. We know the kind of animal it was. We know the age it lived in and the environment it moved through. But we do not know everything. There are still gaps large enough for imagination to breathe. Still room for reevaluation. Still room for better fossils to sharpen the picture. Every fragment recovered from the Middle Jurassic has the potential to slightly redraw the silhouette of the dinosaur that launched a science. That possibility keeps Megalosaurus alive in a very real sense. Not alive as flesh, but alive as a question. And that may be the greatest hook of all. After centuries of study, after landmark papers and museum displays and academic revisions, the first named dinosaur is still not finished telling us who it was. Which means the story of Megalosaurus is not really over. It has only reached one of its most intriguing pauses. If you strip away the fame, the old artwork, the museum prestige, and the sheer historical weight, what remains is something more primal. A hunter moving through a lost England under a climate and sky no human would recognize, carrying in its bones both a scientific revolution and a secret we are still trying to fully uncover. That dual identity is what makes Megalosaurus unforgettable. It is both a real animal and a symbol of a turning point in human thought. A predator from the Middle Jurassic and a key that unlocked deep time. Long before children memorized dinosaur names, before skeletons became the stars of grand museum halls, before film and fiction transformed prehistoric animals into icons, Megalosaurus had already done something extraordinary. It forced people to confront the possibility that the Earth had once belonged to creatures beyond anything in recorded memory. That is not a small achievement. It is not even merely a scientific one. It is philosophical. Megalosaurus helped crack open the old, comfortable idea of history and replace it with something vaster and more unsettling. It made the world older, stranger, and more dramatic than people had dared to imagine. And maybe that is why the story still grips us. Because at its core, this is not only about a dinosaur. It is about the moment the human mind begins to realize how incomplete its own picture of reality has been. A bone appears, then another. The known world trembles. Explanations fail. The past expands. That pattern repeats across science again and again, but Megalosaurus stands at one of the earliest and most dramatic versions of it. The fossil record was not just revealing a new species. It was revealing that entire worlds had lived and died without us. That perspective changes how we should see the animal itself. Megalosaurus was not simply important because it was first. It was important because it embodied a confrontation between ignorance and evidence. Each fossil fragment was a challenge. Each reinterpretation was an admission that the previous answer had not gone far enough. This dinosaur did not politely introduce itself to science. It dragged science toward a larger truth. And it did so while remaining maddeningly incomplete, as if even now it refuses to give everything away at once. That is fitting, because the real power of Megalosaurus has always come from suspense. First, the suspense of identification, then the suspense of reconstruction, then the suspense of ecological context. Even today, there is suspense in how much more the fossil record may still reveal. We know enough to respect the animal. We do not know enough to be bored by it. That is a rare balance. Some dinosaurs are famous because they are visually extravagant. Megalosaurus is memorable because it still feels like an unfolding discovery. Picture it one last time, as an animal, not a chapter title. The vegetation is thick. The air is warm and damp. Insects pulse in the background. Somewhere near a shoreline or a mosaic of islands and shallow channels, a large theropod moves with deliberate control. Its body is solid, muscular, efficient. Its head is carried with the confidence of a predator that has earned its place. It is not the largest carnivore that will ever exist. It does not need to be. In its world, at its moment in time, it is enough. More than enough. It watches, waits, advances. Its life is not mythic because it is exaggerated. It is mythic because it was real. And reality gave it a second life, stranger than the first. Millions of years after it vanished, humans would find its remains and misunderstand them, then fear them, then study them, then argue over them, then build an entire scientific language around creatures like it. Few animals have had such a dramatic afterlife. Megalosaurus hunted in the Jurassic, but it also hunted its way into human thought, stalking the edge of understanding until people finally created a category large enough to hold it. That alone should have guaranteed it immortality in popular imagination. Instead, it became something quieter, foundational rather than flashy, legendary without always being celebrated. But perhaps there is dignity in that. The first breach in the wall is rarely the one people admire most. Later generations remember the armies that poured through. Megalosaurus was the breach. It was the first convincing signal that the stones beneath England held evidence of a world so old, so violent, and so magnificent that modern science would have to reinvent itself to explain it. So when people ask why Megalosaurus matters, the answer is bigger than taxonomy, bigger than museum labels, bigger even than the fact that it was the first validly named dinosaur. Megalosaurus matters because it marks the exact point where the prehistoric past stopped being rumor and started becoming evidence. It matters because it turned isolated bones into a narrative. It matters because it helped humanity understand that monsters were not merely stories invented to explain fear in the dark. Sometimes they were animals. Sometimes they had weight, muscle, teeth, and names. Sometimes they walked real ground under real skies. Sometimes they ruled worlds that existed long before ours. And perhaps most importantly, Megalosaurus matters because it still invites wonder. Not childish wonder, but the deeper kind. The kind born from realizing how much of reality lies beyond first impressions. A femur mistaken for an elephant becomes the doorway to dinosauria. A fragmentary predator becomes a monument in paleontology. A great lizard becomes proof that history is far grander than memory. That transformation is almost poetic. It tells us that truth often begins in confusion, that discovery often looks ridiculous in its early stages, and that some of the most world-changing revelations begin as a single object that nobody can properly explain. That is the legacy of Megalosaurus. Not just a predator, but an awakening. Not just a dinosaur, but a threshold. And maybe the reason it still feels so compelling is because, in a sense, we are still standing where Buckland once stood, staring at incomplete bones, aware that they point to something enormous, and trying to assemble a vanished creature from silence. We know far more now than he did, but the feeling is still there, the thrill, the uncertainty, the sense that beneath every answer lies another question. And that is exactly where Megalosaurus has always been strongest. Not simply in what it revealed, but in what it still withholds.